Welcome back to Diary of a Speed Reader. Today we're going to be talking about why Gödel, Escher Bach is such a difficult book to read. It's a book I've given 4 stars. Now, Gödel, Escher Bach is one of my most viewed videos, but oddly enough, my most controversial. And I love it. The criticisms that have come in have been very respectful. And the way that I take them is it's from people that love this book. This book meant so much to them that they're really just expressing. I want to promote that. If people cared that much about the book, that's awesome. And if you bothered to even give me 2 seconds more of your life after watching my video, I'm so thankful. That's great. But I stand by my 4-star rating because Gödel, Escher Bach was written in a format that makes it hard and unapproachable for many. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. That doesn't mean the book isn't brilliant, but it's something that I talk about in my 7 Skills of Speed Reading course that you will need to be on an advanced level at across all 7 skills before this book becomes easily digestible. And I didn't realize how good an example Gödel, Escher Bach is until I started getting the comment. I am going to go through what makes this book difficult to read, give some suggestions for how to make it a little bit easier to digest, and then finally, if you just love Hofstadter, we're going to talk about him more, so hopefully you'll stay tuned. But before we get into that, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. It means so much to me to have anyone care enough about my videos. Additionally, I want to shout out and thank you to the gentleman that commented. I totally thought it was very respectful the way that you printed that. I know it's scary in 2020 to give any feedback to anyone on the internet. Now, let's get into what made Gödel, Escher Bach difficult to read. The first thing I want to talk about is what does it mean to have good reading comprehension? What does it mean to understand a book? And in that regard, the comments seem to be concerned that given my speed, I didn't understand enough. But it wasn't that I didn't understand, it's more the nuances that they felt were really important. They wanted me to highlight more of. Did I understand the book? Probably yes. Did I understand it at above average level? Also probably yes. Now, did I understand it like the professor who has a 1-hour lecture on Gödel, Escher Bach on YouTube? No. That guy really loves Gödel, Escher Bach, and he is so passionate and so knowledgeable. You should go to him if you're looking for that in-depth knowledge. I can give you some knowledge, I can give you some highlights, but he has studied that piece to a core, and I think that's awesome. That's also true if I reviewed Moby Dick, by the way. There's going to be some Herman Melville expert that's out there that knows way more, who loves Moby Dick. There are levels of understanding of every single book, and I'm always thrilled when an author tells me that I got them. But until Douglas Hofstadter lets me know that, I think it's hard to say that I've got him perfectly. What I will say is the most important thing to know that you understood the author is actually being able to outline the book, being able to pull from chapter to chapter what is the salient point. And that I definitely did. There was one element that you guys criticized on chapter 2, and then I went back and read actually the whole book, and I'm actually fairly sure that I've got the main point correctly, especially since Hofstadter in that chapter says, and this is my point, before he then writes almost a paraphrase of what I then wrote in a little bit more detail on the chapter in my Goodreads. So if that's something that you missed, I want to now talk to point 2. Now, in my course, The 7 Skills of Speed Reading, I go over this in the 7th and hardest skill to acquire, which is background knowledge. And you'll spend your entire life growing background knowledge, and that will actually help you to read faster and faster. In the absence of background knowledge, it actually doesn't matter how fast or slow you read a book, you won't be able to understand it. Just like if you're in the middle of a conversation that has nothing to do with anything that you've ever experienced, you will also be confused. Well, reading is actually no different. This is a total misunderstanding. What will happen if you are missing like pieces of background knowledge is that your mind will latch on to the part of the books that it understood the best and make that the main idea of the book. It's so common, you actually have to train yourself out of it. And this is what makes Gödel, Escher Bach both exceptionally brilliant, but also exceptionally difficult. Exceptionally brilliant because what Hofstadter does is he mixes a number of different themes that are going on in the late 70s that are cutting edge. These are themes in social science, these are themes in the sciences, these are themes in the arts. It's a whole host of things, and he's covering all of it. but he's also kind of requiring that you have it in your brain as you're reading him. And as a result, when I read the comments both on my Goodreads as well as on my YouTube station, I kind of can tell that this has happened. It's actually not the first time it's happened on books, and that is part of the reason when I review a book, I do review what other people have also reviewed on the book to see where some of the missing gaps might be occurring. Now, I'm going to go through some of the books that could be great in the way of background information and demonstrate the brilliance of Hofstadter, because he's actually covering this entire groundwork of stuff that's so thoughtful and continues to be a part of academia today. But before we go into that, I do want to describe one other technique in advanced pattern recognition that he's using that is particularly difficult, and that's what I call the funnel technique. Now, funnel technique is when you go way back and you slowly bring your audience to your aha point. Usually today in 2020, it's going to be less used. And when it is used, it's used in a particular way that's a little bit easier for the audience to come with. It's not going to be the way that he's used it, which is bringing in a lot of different examples across and then coming to an aha point. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell does this in Talking Strangers, and I also kind of criticize him for that because he doesn't get to his main idea till chapter 2 even. Typically, when it is used in modern times, it's going to be a short funnel. And my hypothesis for why that is has to do with the fact that in 1979, when this book was published, it really would have been white male academics that would have attempted to take on Gödel, Escher, Bach, a 700+ page book that really does have math proofs in it as well as computer programming language. In 2020, your audience is just broader. There's people all internationally with all kinds of different backgrounds that may misunderstand you or may not have the full extent of your background. Still, for a lot of people, Gödel, Escher, Bach crosses their desk by some mentor who's already assessed whether or not their background knowledge is adequate. I just think that Hofstadter is so brilliant, it shouldn't be like that. And in fact, there are many books that are dealing with very difficult concepts that equally ring into my mind and become recommendations for me that don't use this technique at all and are therefore somewhat more approachable. And to be even more precise, in that first chapter alone, there are 31 pages before we get to the main idea of the book. And during those 31 pages, he goes through some math proofs so that he can lead you to the history of Gödel. He goes through Escher. He goes through the brilliance of Bach. All of those three things do become themes, but from a pure, like, I'm in 2020 trying to understand it perspective, as a speed reader, I have a huge advantage because, you know, that is something I can traverse in about 3 minutes, but 31 pages would typically take, where the average reader is today in 2020, it would take them 31 minutes. You got to hold that entire funnel for 31 minutes before you come to the main point. And he's guilty of that at several different places throughout this book. That's why I removed the star. I actually did not remove a star for him requiring background knowledge, but I do want to speak to the breadth with which he covers. Yes, Gödel, you kind of need to have a sense. You can Wikipedia that. Yes, Bach, listen to the 2-part inventions and the 3-part inventions and notice the patterns, notice what's going on there and how those are blended so simply to create a really robust piece of music. Yes, Escher, and you can look at all kinds of pictures of Escher. Most people are going to then have footnotes underneath that you'll read about the brilliance of the art itself. There's also a wonderful museum that I went to. I actually left Amsterdam because I'm not big of a fan of Escher to go to the Hague and then stayed overnight so I could really enjoy the museum. They do have a website. You can look there as well. Lots of passionate information on that. But Hofstadter is talking about so much more than that, because thinking to him is thinking. And in a lot of ways, you know, philosophy branched out into every single field that we have, both soft sciences and hard sciences and total liberal arts. And for the next 3 decades, we start to break apart each area into specializations where you have less and less of liberal arts remaining. So, you know, Hofstadter recognizes that. This is 1979, and it's clear as day in this book that that is kind of what you need in the background. And that is kind of a little bit of a different direction than where things had started to go in the field of education. Now, last point on reading before I get into the books that could be very complementary is this idea that speed is what constitutes comprehension, or has some component to comprehension, and that is a misunderstanding of speed reading itself. And it's really one of my bugbears, because a lot of the hoaxsters in speed reading are promoting this idea of speed that is not true, or is unfortunately confusing the point. Everyone has a speed for which they are comfortable at reading. It's just that at this point in history, we make that speed so much slower than it needs to be, and that is because we stop teaching reading skills at a certain point. Additionally, it also might be because very few people bother to take the time to learn what it would take to make people read faster. But actually, reading is like any other skill. You can get better at it. Just like if I'm driving down a road and I'm a less experienced driver, there's tons of obstacles, I'm gonna take it a lot slower and a lot easier. Someone that's an advanced reader will still take it slower than if it was just a straight way, but they're gonna take it a little differently because they have a different experience level with reading, they have a different background, they maybe have more years doing it. In the land of reading, what will happen though is that the speed with which you read is directly related to the traps that might exist. In this case, I told you that he's really exploiting two that I have put in advanced pattern recognition. That's part of the reason why, if you look at my speed, I'm reading at about half my actual average pace. Now, some people felt that I needed to stop at every chapter and have these deep thoughts, and I totally understand why you would feel that way, and that is something that you absolutely should do if your pace is like under 1,500 words per minute. At my pace, you actually do it a little bit differently because your speed isn't being hampered by like weaknesses in the other 6 skills of speed reading. What you're gonna do is you're gonna actually at each chapter note the main thing that then carries into the next chapter. And you're gonna continue reading the whole book for the full argument the author is trying to make, just like you would listen to a whole conversation and hear them from point 1 to point Z, and hold that judgment back. Then you're going to actually go back and look at what you didn't understand and reflect and review further on those points in the context of the full conversation. Now that's something that's not taught very often, but is so vital to reading comprehension, and also is vital to retention. Coming back to the book after you've finished reading it and reflecting on the points that you understood, didn't understand, and then covering those gaps and revisiting what the man said. It's so important, and definitely something pretty much every speed reader will do, but is not easy to do if you've now spent 20 hours with the book and are just exhausted. Now, along those lines, I've been speed reading for over a decade, so it was pretty straightforward for me to recommend this list that covers this broad spectrum that Hofstadter really affects, as well as the broad spectrum that he's anticipating that you have in your zeitgeist, in your mental cloud, if you will. Let's go through some of the areas that I think you could read on to make this book more helpful, or if you're in school reading this and thinking, oh, I want to write a paper that really compares Hofstadter or something, all these books are fair game. You know, if math is your bugbear, read Euclid's Elements of Geometry. It's not nearly as hard or as nerdy as it sounds, but I think the thing to take away as you're reading it in the context of Hofstadter is that Euclid is just some dude putting rules together, the same as any video game guy is like putting rules together for the first time. That is absolutely an element of this book. It's going to support some of the things that Hofstadter says that are a little bit more mathematical, and you're going to get used to some of the math language. Now, probably one of my favorite themes that Gödel, Escher, Bach becomes relevant for is structuralism. This idea that there is this framework and that framework might have errors or inconsistencies. And in that regard, there's any number of areas within both political science, cognitive science, and philosophy that are relevant. I'm going to say that one of my favorites given contemporary times is Kwame Apia's book, Ethics of Identity. Also, Essays on Human Understanding by John Locke, as well as Minsky's book, Society of the Mind. All of those are going to give you a sense for what thinking is, independent of the frameworks that are established on logical process. So in that regard, very, very valuable to appreciating why Hofstadter is speaking the way he's speaking and what he's maybe even talking antagonistic toward. Now, along those lines, I would also read Emile by Rousseau, because in a lot of ways, he's speaking right into this dialogue that is a little bit messed up, not to say the least. And in fact, that is the brilliance of Gödel, whether Hofstadter's directly speaking to it or not. This idea that the framework itself could be an error and may have consistencies or inconsistencies. Now, along those lines, memes become important, and one of the best ones on that is Virus of the Mind. That book I have a video as well on, and it kind of speaks to this consistency, inconsistency. It's written after Gödel, Escher Bach, but really explains to you some of the stakes that are involved with this book. I'd also recommend Thomas Kuhn's book. Kuhn is brilliant, but in my opinion, he's a little bit easier to read than Gödel, Escher Bach. They come kind of really alongside each other, both in the way that they're kind of addressing some of the things that are the result of Emile Rousseau's book, but also, just kind of this whole impact of Gödel on the scientific community. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't suggest something from Socrates, and in that regard, Phaedrus is probably the one that people would steer you towards, but I prefer the Republic. And, I know a lot of people may have their own opinions on that, so feel free to comment below. There's a style of writing that is kind of his deal. These two books, Phaedrus and the Republic, are short, but they're jam-packed, and so they are hard to get through by yourself. Now, I know not everybody is a speed reader, and a lot of people have kids and other responsibilities, so that list is just the most enormous, painful list you've ever heard. But the fact is, those books, every single one is thematic to other books and is relevant in ways that are more than just the time that you're going to spend. And that's true of Gödel, Escher Bach as well. It's going to continue to ring through to other books. That's why I recommend it to other people. That's why I even reference it when I'm reviewing someone else's piece of literature, particularly in areas like cognitive science and also even in philosophy. Now, again, I really want to make it clear, the two gentlemen that wrote in, they probably do understand this book so much more than I do. It's totally possible. Definitely the professor that I mentioned understands it better than I do. But what I wanted from the book was to be able to have a conversation with my friend who absolutely glows about this book when he reads it. And he conceded the point that, yeah, you're right, Hofstadter does actually write in those difficult manners, but is he brilliant? And my response was, yeah, he's brilliant. I'm totally gonna review him, he's great. So that is, in case it was unclear, where I stand on this book. Now, I hope that this didn't make it intimidating for you to read, and also all of the books that I think are either an influence to or influenced by the words that Hofstadter has put into the cloud of knowledge that we call human knowledge now. I hope those are also inspiring for you to take a look at. Thank you guys again for watching my videos, liking, sharing, and commenting. I hope everybody is doing great from a health perspective. Things are really crazy here in New York, but getting better every day. I still love this city, and I will see you guys next time.